This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hindu's In Focus podcast. I'm Zubaida Hamid, your host for today. What's a quick measure of how healthy you are? Most people would say body mass index or BMI. But increasingly, experts have come to the conclusion that BMI has several limitations. Why? For one thing, it was made using data from 19th century Europeans and does not work well across different populations. For another, it does not tell you the composition of your weight or, crucially, where that weight is located. Indians, for instance, are genetically predisposed to putting on more weight around the abdomen region, and it is this visceral fat that puts us at risk of various diseases, including diabetes. And this is where another index comes in, the Body Roundness Index or BRI. Devised in 2013, studies now over the last decade have shown that BRI may be a better predictor of what health risks you may face. BRI, unlike BMI, takes your waist circumference into account, essentially letting you know if you are too round and therefore unhealthy. How does the BRI calculation work? What has research shown about it so far? And is it a better metric for Indians to use? We delve into these questions and more with Diana Thomas, the mathematician who devised BRI and who is a full professor at the Department of Mathematical Sciences, United States Military Academy, West Point. Hello and welcome to the Hindu's In Focus podcast, Dr. Diana Thomas.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's such a pleasure and honor to be on this podcast.
Dr. Thomas, could you tell us how and why you decided to come up with the BRI formula?
Yes. So I'm a mathematician by training, and so I looked at the body mass index as a geometrical object, or the underpinnings of a geometrical object, and that object turns out to be a cylinder. And I thought to myself, really, if you're taking human bodies and enclosing them in a cylinder and treating them all the same, well, women's bodies usually are not cylindrical. We have curves. And so with waist and height, I can encapsulate the human body in an ellipse. And the ellipse captures more of body shape. And my body shape in general, because I'm a woman, I look in the mirror and I don't look cylindrical, I hope. I look more egg-shaped. And so that's where I started working with the Body Roundness Index.
Tell us a little bit about your 2013 paper.
So it was a team of us, and senior author was Steve Heimsfield, and we were interested in body composition. The classifications for obesity come from percent body fat. And also we were interested in predicting percent visceral adipose tissue as well, which is the belly fat, the air fat that's above your in your stomach. And so we looked at encapsulating the human body by an ellipse. And then there's this property from the ellipse. If you remember back to pre-calculus, taught probably 7th to 8th grade, there's a number called eccentricity, which tells you how round the ellipse is or how close the ellipse is to being a circle. So this number ranges from 0 to 1. 1 is a straight line and 0 is a circle. And so the higher or the lower this value is, the closer the ellipse is to being a circle. So we used eccentricity, other demographic, easily measurable properties of a human, age, gender, and developed prediction models to predict percent body fat and percent visceral adipose tissue. And we also looked at how eccentricity can be related back to percent body fat at a healthy and unhealthy range. So we estimated healthy and unhealthy ranges of eccentricity and body roundness index. Body roundness index is just a mapping that makes it easier for non-technical audiences to look at this number, because eccentricity tends to be a number between 0 to 1. It's hard to look at. So we just mapped it to nice integers so people can look at those numbers and go, okay, this number's in the range or out of the range easily.
So Body Roundness Index takes into account your waist circumference, correct? And it tells you whether or not there is too much fat around your abdomen.
It's a little bit more than that. So we used waist circumference. We used the diameter, assuming that right around the waist we can enclose it with a circle. We use the diameter of that circle for what we call the minor axis, and we use the height as the major axis. So it's not just waist circumference, it accounts for height. So waist and height are related to each other, and what we did assumes a geometrical representation of the body. So they're geometrical normalizations of waist for height. You can think of it like that. And so that's how we used waist. Eccentricity tells you how round you are as a person. So it counts for waist and height. Encapsulate the person by ellipse and then see how round they are, basically. That number tells you how round they are. And so if you do have more fat around the waist and it's normalized for your height, yes, you will be more round. Does that answer it?
Yes. So that was one of the problems with the BMI, correct? That it did not take it told you that you were either overweight or obese, but it did not tell you where specifically the weight was and if that weight was in the problematic region of belly fat, correct?
Yeah, it doesn't look at shape at all. It really assumes the human body is a cylinder. And really, what it does is it normalizes your body weight for your height. So if I have to convert to kilograms, but I'm about 55 kilograms myself, and if I was 6 feet tall, which I'd have to change that, 170 centimeters tall, then you would have a different image of me than my true height, which is about 163 centimeters. So what BMI does is it takes everybody's weight and it normalizes for height. So we don't have to think about the person's height. What BRI does is it takes the person's waist and normalizes it for height. And so it gives you more of a picture of a body shape than it does your weight being normalized for height. I hope that makes sense. It's pretty technical, but I hope that makes sense.
It does. And now we, of course, know research has shown us that belly fat or visceral fat is the most problematic fat that there is. And this is especially the case for people in India who are anyway genetically predisposed to putting on weight in that region, and therefore, this perhaps leading to insulin resistance and diabetes.
Correct. That's why we were trying to predict visceral adipose tissue, and then we did do comparisons with BMI and what we get without any assumption about body shape, and we did show that it was added value in that paper, in that 2013 paper, and that BRI does better at predicting visceral adipose tissue, which makes sense.
So tell us a little bit about the recent JAMA study that did mortality predictions for a whole bunch of adults based in the United States and found a U-shaped curve while using BRI. Why is it that mortality is high if your BRI is really low or if your BRI is really high?
All right, so this is an interesting question. You can take any one of these indices and see how they explain mortality or any other outcome, but this particular paper was about mortality. And what it found was if you have a BRI that's too low, you're too thin, then your mortality goes up. That's one part of the U. And then there's a nadir, and then you find that after that nadir, mortality goes up again. So basically, being too thin and too big or round, in this case, because they were using BRI, are out of a healthy zone for mortality, with mortality as the endpoint. And that's why you have this U shape. There's different ways to visualize it. So they did the U-shaped curve, right? We did in relation to healthy zones. So going inside the healthy zone, your ellipse is too small. You have you're in an unhealthy region of percent body fat, and if you go out of that zone, you're in an unhealthy region because you're too round. So we found the same thing when we looked at percent body fat as the outcome. We just visualized it differently.
So the study found that the higher your BRI, which means the rounder that you are, the more your mortality risk is.
Yes, and
That
the lower it is. So there's like a sweet spot, basically.
so you should be ideally somewhere in the middle,
Yes.
not too round and not too underweight.
Yes.
Okay, got that. Could you talk to us a little bit about you told us how it works, what the calculation is like. So does it favor slender bodies and categorize maybe slightly rounder bodies as not healthy? Is that are different kinds of bodies, different shapes of bodies perhaps not fully taken into account? How does it work?
This is a great question because when we wrote the paper in 2013, most manual big data sets had waist circumference, and the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in the United States has also hip circumference. So you can use hip as well, and encapsulate the person into an ellipse. And yes, when you say favors, what it's pointing out is outcomes such as percent body fat are in a healthy range at the sweet spot. If it's too low, if you have a smaller body, this measurement, like BMI, suggests that mortality goes up. So there's an unhealthy region. So it does, I wouldn't say favor. It's not, it's a model. It doesn't have emotions. So it doesn't favor one or the other. It just tells you a fact that if your body's too thin, then, or too narrow or close to being straight, like a pencil, you are in an unhealthy range. And if you are too round, you're also in an unhealthy range. So this is just correlations and numbers. So it's not a favoring. I get where people would say favoring. I'm also a human, although my students might not think so. I'm also a human. I step on scales. I'm sometimes unhappy with what I see. So I get that. But the model is just telling you where you need to be.
How much research has been done on BRI and on BRI versus BMI?
Quite a bit, actually. There's been, I can't count the number of papers, but I think I get a click on my research gate about once a week of a new paper on BRI using Body Roundness Index. Most quality papers should actually compare if they're looking at an outcome. So the research that's been done is looking at different outcomes, which we in the 2013 paper had suggested that people do in the discussion, look at outcomes like cardiovascular health, metabolic health, diabetes. And so that's what people have done. And there's lots of research actually done in Asian countries on BRI, and quality papers should compare it to BMI because BMI is the current standard. And so if you have to explain why this other index would do any better or worse than BMI. And so most quality papers have done that comparison. And not just with BMI, but other shape indices. So you don't have to use geometry to make a shape index. You can use statistics. Statistically, I found this to be the better formula. There are several shape indices, like there's a body shape index, ABSI. There's several more. I don't remember them all, but a good quality study should compare all of these things against each other so that we have the best index for whatever the outcome is. And most of those studies that I've seen actually have found BRI to be a top predictor, just not what we're not like beholden to it or married to one index, but it has done pretty well.
The criticism of BMI had been that it didn't really take into account various ethnicities. For instance, the Asian ethnicity, which, as we discussed before, has a tendency to put on weight around the waist. Do you think that the BRI would be applicable to different nationalities and different kinds of people?
Yes, I think it dawned on me that's probably why there was such an interest from China. Was a country that had a lot of publications in this area. So that strikes me that might be one of the reasons why it captures that the fact that it captures shape. So in India, we have, for lower BMI, we have higher metabolic risk. And you can, so, if you look at body mass index, if we use the body mass index and the current cutoffs made for a Western country, they don't seem to do well predicting. They'll misclassify people from India as not being at risk when they are at risk. So that's the problem. BRI probably captures that better. But again, the zones that we made were from the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Those zones should be recalculated for other populations.
You think every country should have its own zone calculation for what is healthy and what is not with regard to BRI?
Absolutely. I mean, you if you travel, you can see differences in body shapes. You see differences in let's look at the other end, the healthy end. So if you look at sports, you see differences. You can just watch the Olympics and see differences in body shape dependent on sport. Swimmers look very different than cyclists. And so to use the same index on everybody, not the index, but you're using cutoffs, what is healthy and what is not, on everybody seems ridiculous, actually.
Tell us a little bit about the measurements itself. There was a study that I read about that said that there's a possibility of human error when you're measuring your waist, etc. Is that something that is an area of concern?
Yes, it is. So waist circumference is not an easy measurement to get to obtain. So you need a tape measure. You need to wrap the tape measure around your waist. The World Health Organization does it differently, but in the U.S., what we do is we look for reference bones on the side called the iliac crest, which is your hip bone. It's right at your hips. You can feel it. In fact, you don't have a video of me, but I'm touching mine right now. And then you take a tape measure and you wrap it around the marker using the iliac crest. This can be hard to find if you have more weight. And also, when wrapping it around, you want it as a perfect line around your waist. And you could pull it too tight, you could have it too loose. And so it's a not a simple measurement to obtain. And even in the U.S. Army, we use waist circumference as a measurement for body standards in the Army. So I've seen people actually do this, and it's incredibly hard to do they call it taping with a waist with a measuring tape. On the other hand, though, I have a wonderful story. I had a friend, a colleague in Mexico that was working with pregnant women. And one of the things about pregnant women coming into studies is they have to already know that they're pregnant to be enrolled in the study. Otherwise, you can't go into a pregnancy study. So she asked them to report their pre-pregnancy weight. And she gave me a data set with all the pre-pregnancy weights, and they were all over the place. They didn't make any sense whatsoever. And it dawned on us a little while later that the women that she was enrolling in her studies didn't have scales. With body mass index, you have to have a measurement of weight, and not everybody owns a scale. And it's not just Mexico. These women were from Mexico. Another colleague of mine said the same thing about Brooklyn, New York. Not everyone owns a scale. And if you don't have a scale, you don't have weight. You'd have to wait till you go to a doctor's office or a place that has a scale. And so I would argue that BMI also requires some measurement. And if you have a scale, it might be an okay measurement, but you have to also own a scale.
Tell us quickly before we sign off, how do we do this at home? How do we measure our BRIs?
My recommendation, so I know that the WHO, the World Health Organization, does it differently, but my recommendation is actually using the Centers for Disease Control. They have a manual on how they collect waist circumference, and to use that manual. I've taught students actually how to do this. As a mathematician, you might think that's weird that I teach students how to do this, but we had a clinic, a weight loss clinic at Montclair State University where I used to work. So I'd get students who were interested in going to medical school, and they wanted to get hands-on experience. And we used the manual that was on the CDC website for the United States for NHANES, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. That particular manual has a description. They recommend actually putting an X on your iliac crest with a marker, that body marker, or you can just put some tape right at your iliac crest. and then having another person do it with you. So they're actually taking the measurement around your waist with you. Research grade and clinical grade measurements of waist circumference ask people to do it 3 times to see if they get the same measurement 3 times. So it just gives you more data points. And it can be done. So it's just, and all you need is a measuring tape. So measuring tape is probably cheaper than a scale. So I recommend that manual.
And then you use the online calculator?
Yeah, then you punch your numbers into the online calculator.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you for having me. This was great. It's great to talk about someone's own research. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
You're very welcome.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.